I hope all the technology is working in our favor and everybody is listening now my voice with a strong Georgian accent, and that the screen that you're seeing is Georgian language or English in case you prefer to follow the discussions in English. I am crossing my fingers that the technology really will help and that there will be no problems, but if there are any technological hiccups, please bear with us. We are trying to make this work as much as possible. So good afternoon once again. I think I see some familiar names. But let me introduce myself. My name is Karl Pfeffer. I'm working for the training center of the ILO here in Turin. Maybe some of you already came here before 2020 to the Turin Training Center, and it's my pleasure to kickstart this webinar series, to facilitate this webinar series, and to co-deliver this webinar series on business and human rights in Georgia, which will take us very well into 2021. Maybe already to highlight that this webinar series is a collaboration between the ILO in Georgia, the government administration of Georgia, and the training center of the ILO. It's one of the many activities that already were rolled out in Georgia on the issue of business and human rights, to create awareness and to sensitize, popularize the concepts or the connection between business and human rights. So I don't need to tell you that it would have been my preference, and I'm also sure Emily's preference, to be with you in Georgia and to enjoy the Georgian hospitality and your company and the discussions. But of course, because of the current situation that we are facing, that's impossible. But at the other hand, look, we are turning a big challenge into an opportunity by having almost already now 43, and I am sure that number will increasing by even having more participants, more people to engage on this topic. Now, before we go with the agenda and the opening remarks, this is the etiquette, the digital etiquettes. But so far so good. So please mute your microphone. In case I assume a lot of you are working from home and maybe small children in the room, not a problem there, but best you mute your microphones. Please use the chat box function. I think that is the easiest way to directly communicate, especially since we already are a large group. Use the chat box functions if you have questions, if you have comments, if you want to make an observation, if you want to share a link, use the chat box function. We don't speak Georgian, but Taco and Kenan's team indicated they will translate it, so we can follow the discussion also. These classes, these webinar series, will be recorded.
Sorry, Carl. I think you need to
Yes.
talk a little slower for the interpreter.
Okay, good.
And if I may jump as well, we will just there's a question in the chat on how to reach the interpretation. Maybe before you continue, I'll just make a comment on how to find the interpretation in the chat, if that's okay.
Yeah,
Yes.
Taco if you can give Taco just that 2 seconds,
Taco,
Carl, to tell.
Would you make that comment, please?
Taco, please.
Because people cannot find interpretation.
Okay, Taco.
მოგესალმებით ყველას. რამდენიმე კომენტარს გავაკეთებ.
Well, a couple of words about technical side. Well, I kindly ask you, well, just to see the interpretation, just option for English and Georgian languages. Well, those who want interpretation on your screen, lower, you will see the globe sign. Globe sign, and click on it, please. And you will choose the language you would like to listen interpretation into. So in this case, Georgian or English. There are two options. So you will be given a couple of minutes to adjust this function. So once again, hopefully there will be no problem. When it comes to the other issue, presentations will be both in English and Georgian languages. So you may follow both of them to this end, to do so, you will see the function option window. And there, you scroll down and you will see Taco Heladze, just person who is responsible for a Georgian presentation. And you will be able to see in both languages, as I said. If you would like to follow in English languages presentation, you will choose Multinational Enterprise Office. So once again, you will have an option to choose,
უფრო მისაღები, რომ პრეზენტაციებს ადევნოთ თვალი. ასევე მეორე ნაწილი არის ძალიან გთხოვთ, რომ თქვენი სახელი შეცვალოთ ან ქართულ ენაზე, ან ლათინური ასობით, რომ იყოს ჩვენთვის გასაგები თქვენი სახელი და თვალი. Carl, I finished comment Georgian. I wanted to also ask Patricia because we received some messages that some participants cannot hear the voice.
Okay.
Sorry, they can't hear?
Yes.
What can't they hear? Sorry.
The voice.
The voices of
The voice. Okay.
Okay. I noticed actually some of them don't have microphones. So if they don't have a microphone, then they can't actually hear.
Okay.
Yeah.
მეგობრებო, ვისაც ხმარ გესმით, თუ შეიძლება გადაამოწმეთ, რომ მიკროფონით იყოთ შემოსული, ანუ თქვენს კომპიუტერს ან ტელეფონს, რომლითაც ხართ შემოსული, უნდა გქონდეს მიკროფონი გააქტიურებული, რომ ხმა გაიგოთ.
Can you also tell them to turn off their videos, please, if they're not talking?
და თუ კი არის საუბრებთ, რომ mute გაუკეთოთ მიკროფონს.
ერთი წუთი თუ შეიძლება მე ეხლა ხან შავერთ ჩემთან არის მოდა ხმა და ენასთან დაკავშირებით ვერ მოусმინე ბოლომდე როგორ ვირჩევ ენას დიდი ბორჯომის მუნიციპალიტეტი უკაცრავად.
თქვენი Zoom-ის ეკრანზე, ეხლა ეს არის გათავსებული ქვედა ნაწილში, უნდა იყოს გლობუსის გამოსახულების ღილაკი.
რო არ არის?
Good. Maybe Taka, you can, if there are issues with sound, that can also be related to the computer itself. That's our experience. It's not one technology that has to go well, but 53 technologies at the same time. But in case people are not hearing or connecting well, sometimes it helps to reconnect, check your settings in terms of microphone and audio, and then it should work. But I think the majority is hearing us clearly.
Yeah,
loud and clear,
just one quick. The interpreter has his microphone on mute. Okay.
So other people also cannot find this globe sign.
We have in the chat box that participants cannot see the interpretation sign.
It's at the bottom of the screen. They should be able to see it.
ეკრანის ქვედა ნაწილზე ნახეთ, აბა, სადაც მონაწილეები.
Please see at the lower part of your screen. It is there. So there are problems with some participants. I mean, the lower part of the screen.
They need to upgrade their Zoom. It happened before. Upgraded the version, it worked. So, but now that would take probably some time.
To upgrade it only takes 5 seconds actually.
Okay, then if they can just upgrade their Zooms and sign back in, this should allow the interpretation feature to be back on.
And it's fine. We have time to sort it out. I understand this. That's not a problem. And also, if you want to update your Zoom, it's fine. We still have some more administrative issues that we have to figure out. So if you have to disconnect, you can always connect afterwards. But the main thing is the interpretation is coming through in Georgian. Yes. You are hearing me speaking in Georgian. Taco, you can hear me in Georgian. I'm being translated?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, Taco, if you want me, I continue, huh? Then because I think there always will be some challenges, huh? Because of computers that are not properly configured or not updated, huh? But I think it's best that we move on. If there is really a continuous problem of connection, we also will make available in any case a recording of this webinar class so that you can pick up where you left now, or if in case you cannot connect, you can always follow it to YouTube, where we will upload the video also afterwards. So no worries in case there is a persistent problem in terms of connectivity. Most likely tomorrow already you will be able to access the recording of this class. So don't worry about that one. Together, not only by the recording of this webinar, we also will have some essential readings that we will be discussing in this webinar series will also be uploaded on the eCampus, which we will make accessible. So I hope now that at least the majority is following the webinar and is listening to it with proper translation. Let's look at the agenda for today that we have crafted for the next 2 hours. So that will be until 4 p.m. in Georgia. We are busy with the welcome and opening remarks and the whole technological dimension of this webinar series. I will give a short introduction to the webinar series in general, and then we go to the main features of today, which will be an introduction to international labor standards and resources, and the second presentation on business and human rights in Georgia. And towards in 1 hour and 35 minutes, we will be going into the closing of this webinar. But first and foremost, I would like to give the floor to Ms. Akiashvili, who took the initiative of putting this webinar series together with the colleagues in ILO Georgia. Ms. Akiashvili, who is the Prime Minister's advisor on human rights and gender equality, for some welcoming remarks. Please, Leila, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Before I start my opening remarks, I'm unable to start the video. If you can help me with that one.
Yes, I'll do it for them.
Thank you. Okay, it's better now. Good. If you will not mind, I will do my opening remarks in Georgian, so that participants can.
I'd like to welcome dear colleagues. I'm very glad that we are here together to participate in a very interesting event, the webinar seminars, which will address issues of human rights, ILO standards and approaches. COVID-19 pandemic showed once again how important and close is link between business and human rights. Well, in Georgia, we have addressed for last year this issue in a very serious way. Well, labor rights, supporting people, anti-crisis plans of the government to help people in this situation. Well, different activities, engagement of business to support a vulnerable group of people, and many other issues. Though in addition to COVID-19 pandemic, which is of course global challenge, well, we also face global challenges. I mean, first of all, business circles, and this is a problem all over the world and which has negative impact on our daily life. Well, also important is the role of social networks, discuss issues like employment, unemployment issues, and, well, to cut it short, challenges we face all over the world. What I'm driving at, if we talk today about human rights and about the responsibility of protection of human rights, and who are the major actors in this respect? Of course, first and foremost, the government. Well, the state is responsible to protect human rights, and we're fully aware of this obligation. But at the same time, it's crucially important to make sure that human rights protection cannot be comprehensive if we would fail to work with actors, all interested parties, stakeholders who are on the other side, if you wish, and they are bound to play a very active role, sometimes no less active role than the states themselves. Therefore, well, UN guiding principles were elaborated, and because in UN it became crystal clear that all stakeholders have to work together, and they created a document which is kind of framework document within which we have to address many issues and which challenges deserve our special attention when it comes to human rights and business, which is a crossing point. So which are these crossing points, or whether the business and human rights have common denominator? Of course, business and human rights are multi-sectoral phenomenon, and indeed, therefore, our approach should be also multi-sectoral, and our response should be as comprehensive as possible. For UN as well as for Georgia, business and human rights, maybe is more or less new, priority. This direction is not all, long-standing as a priority. And all these priorities have been reflected in the action plan, chapter number 25, where you will find very important steps to be taken and which should be taken by states to better protect human rights. Today, we'll present our action plan. I will present later on, but once again, let me underline that the role of business and human rights is ever increasing. And the new strategy on which we are working right now, which is still in the making, business and human rights linkage between the two will be high on agenda. Taking into account these needs, fully aware of the topicality of this issue, we decided to start to launch webinar, seminar, and my special thanks go to ILO experts and representatives at the international level, as well as ILO representation in Georgia. And thank you very much for cooperation in good faith, for being responsive. Webinars and trainings are, just applied in different countries, and we try to do the same in our country, and I'm sure that there will be follow-up activities up until February, middle of February next year. My special thanks go to the Civil Service Bureau, because Civil Service Bureau would guarantee engagement of civil servants in these activities, and you see the high interest of stakeholders and participants in this event. A series of webinars, as I mentioned, is a new format, and we're doing these for the first time, and it's kind of pilot project for us as well. Therefore, your feedbacks, your points of view, remarks, reservations are welcome indeed. Therefore, I would like to call upon you, just for a contact person, Meriko Kajai is our contact person. If you have any ideas, how to improve, how to make this webinar better, please get in touch with her, because it is crucially important for us to know your points of view, your preferences, in order to improve the quality of this work. So, yeah, well, we work in COVID-19 reality, as Carl mentioned. Well, there are also new opportunities together with challenges, and we have got to make best use of these opportunities. And also, I'd like to underline the importance of participation of representatives of local authorities. And because local authorities' role in many respects, when it comes to business, human rights, the linkage between the two is of utmost importance because they are very close, to the people, and they are to implement these values and principles in real life. Well, interest toward webinars serial is very high, and initially more than 150 participants got registered, and now there are around 60 or a little bit more than 60 participants. So frankly speaking, I did not expect such high interest. And certificate which will be issued if participants would attend every single seminar. And well, and we thought that at least around 50 participants will get these certificates. Yet this is first seminar, and you will see firsthand participants about the content, and maybe later on we'll have to divide these participants into two groups, because no more than 50 participants is desirable in per group. So if you would attend all 7 webinars, you will get certificate. And I would like once again to thank ILO. So I will not go into greater details about the topics of webinar seminars. Today, this kind of introduction to make sure that we know the major principles when it comes to cooperation between business, or when it comes to linkage between business and human rights. And later on, we'll address more specific issues like child, labor, forced labor, OSH-related issues, employment-related issues, complaints mechanism, women's rights, collective bargaining, and so on and so forth. Well, as a conclusion, I would like to tell you, and we are almost all public servants, and let me repeat myself, this is a new format for us, and I'm sure that I will learn a lot important and new things, and I think all this would help us to improve the cooperation or the linkage between the human rights activists and business circles. Well, we are responsible, our agency, to protect human rights, and especially when it comes to very sensitive issues like child labor, forced labor, OSH-related issues, and other issues, despite the fact where we work, or in which field, these issues are really, really very relevant. And we're here to discuss issues together, and then every single of us, maybe one day or sooner or later, will become expert himself or herself, and will go deeper and deeper into this issue, and will serve as advocates of this issue. On the part of human rights team, my team, I can assure you that we're open for cooperation and an initiative, well, initiated by local authorities or business circles or human rights organizations. We will embrace them. Together we can elaborate new guidelines. So once again, we are at your disposals. We are ready to cooperate in good faith. And I would like to assure you that every single idea will be considered and taken into due account. Once again, I would like to thank our trainers, and as one of the participants, I will be very attentive and I'm all ears. Thank you.
And I would like to give the floor now to Ms. Kardavi from the Civil Service Bureau of Georgia, and I see you already are visible and using the camera. So please, Ms. Kardavi, it's up to you.
Thank you very much. მოგესალმებით ყველას. პირველ რიგში დიდი მადლობა.
Everybody, I would like to thank you first of all for using this platform, communication platform, which is available, and it was initiated by Civil Servant Bureau. I'm very glad to be with you, and well, and this is a very important opportunity to share knowledge and experience, especially when it comes to human rights and business. I'm also very glad that ILO representatives are very active and are doing their best to share their vast experience, to talk about ILO standards, and of course to get this information, from first hand, from very knowledgeable sources is a matter of utmost importance. Thank you very much, Lila, for supporting this initiative. I would like to thank Human Rights Secretariat and the Prime Minister of Georgia. Thank you for this initiative. And of course, ILO, my special thanks go to ILO for giving this ample opportunity. I fully agree with you that there is high interest among public servants, and of course we envisage certain number of participants, and there are many people who are willing to attend this webinar seminar. Well, as it was mentioned, this is the first introductory webinar seminar, and I think it will be very informative, and I'm sure that all of them will come to appreciate the relevance of such courses, and hopefully all of them, or vast majority of them, will decide to participate in all 7 seminars. Of course, it's up to them. I'm very glad that such an ample opportunity is given to our public servants, and the Civil Service Bureau will be very actively engaged to the very end. And I'm sure our staff members will be active as well. So this is, I know, just introductory word or welcome work, but couple of words why we deem these issues important for public servants. So I look at the agenda and issues to be addressed within the framework of whole series of these webinars. So, of course, all these issues are very important, especially when it comes to issues like child labor, forced labor. So, and it's very important for employers as well. You know that new law was adopted on public service, and where you will find very detailed rights and obligations of public servants. And there are a special chapter is dedicated to guarantees, rights, and obligations of public servants. This is chapter number 7. And I would like to draw attention to Article 56 of this law about necessity to create proper working conditions for public servants. As it was mentioned by Lela, this is very important, and it's important not only for public sector but for private sector as well. And it's crucially important to guarantee workers with adequate working conditions. Once again, let me repeat myself, this issue is very topical, especially against the background of current reality, COVID-19 reality. Now we work mostly remotely, and in order to make sure that we work effectively from home, of course, we have to think about adequate equipments, adequate, conditions to make sure that working remotely will be effective and efficient. Naturally enough, we have challenges in this respect, naturally enough, and we should be ready to address these problems and challenges. And that's what we're doing in our public service bureaus. And of course, it will be very important to share the best practice from different countries, ILO standards, ILO approaches in this respect, and hopefully it will help us to better prepare for facing and responding COVID-19 related challenges, and to be better concentrated on important issues. At the same time, once again, we are obliged to provide adequate working conditions. This is not an easy challenge, no doubt about that. But I do hope that these issues will be also in the center of attention in the course of debates and in the course of these seminars. So I will not go into greater details. Of course, I can talk a lot about this issue, how to better protect public servants, but, well, of course, but I will not go beyond now my competencies and time limit, but I do hope that in the course of this webinar serial, well, these issues will be addressed, and we have special, by the way, event on this issue forum where we addressed in greater details those issues. Once again, so if Ms. Lela and her team would decide, to have another event in another forum on these issues, we are ready, we're at your disposal. Thank you very much. I wish you a very successful seminar, and I do hope that our public servants will learn a lot. They are motivated to develop themselves, to develop their professional skills, and I'm sure these 7 seminars will be very conducive to this noble end. Thank you. Madloba.
Conclude this round of welcoming remarks. I would like to hand over now to Kenan. Kenan, please.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Ms. Akeshvili, Ms. Gardava, for the wonderful remarks and for your support on this. For those who do not know me, I'm Kenan Banasi. I'm the ILO Chief Technical Advisor of the ILO project in Georgia. On behalf of the ILO, I would like to welcome you all to this introductory session. As you heard, the session is part of a webinar series on business and human rights. And these sessions are all organized in partnership with the Office of Ms. Akeshvili, the Human Rights Secretariat, and the Civil Service Bureau of Georgia. Of course, the session, as you also heard by Carl earlier, that they are implemented in partnership, I must say in a strong partnership with the ITC, the International Training Center of the ILO in Turin. As we all know, the government of Georgia launched the National Action Plan to support the implementation from one way, the UN guiding principles, as Ms. Akeshvili said, on human rights, and from another, to also strengthen the implementation of the fundamental ILO conventions, those conventions that are all adopted by Georgia. The aim of the plan is crucial, and it's meant to develop a strong business practices in Georgia that ensure respect for the human rights and create quality jobs for everyone. According to the conventions and the UN guiding principles, businesses are responsible for ensuring that their operations do not infringe on human rights, particularly when it's related by the impact of their business decisions and, of course, the internal business operations. There are so many rights that are undermined by businesses today. Could be because of lack of awareness or education, or it could be because of lack of strong compliance mechanisms in the country. However, However, we have recently witnessed a very positive improvement in Georgia. And those, especially with regard to the labor safety law, that has significantly contributing to the improvement of working conditions on health and safety which was adopted in 2019. And of course, the historic reform that took place a couple of months ago on the labor code. And I'm sure that most of us are very excited about this new law as it will basically reshape the practices in the labor market completely. As you go through some of these webinars, you'll be able to understand what these guiding principles and international labor standards are, as well what it means to have a responsible business. I mean, we often keep hearing this term, responsible business, and sometimes it's associated only with environment. Sometimes it's associated with business ethics. Sometimes but we will actually try to go a bit more in details to unpack what it means, and also we will define clearly what the ILO's definition of decent work, a term that ILO has been promoting over decades and decades, and we're proudly saying that in Georgia, many of our fundamental principles have been now implemented, or at least on the way to be implemented. We hope that this series will shed light on important issues related to the implementation of the business and human rights chapter in Georgia. The webinars will highlight the contributions of the ILO conventions to the business and human rights under a broader agenda, the agenda of the decent work and sustainable development. Let me now, not to go more on that and allow you to enjoy the substance of today's session. I wish you all a very enjoyable learning and a fruitful discussion. And as Ms. Akiashvili said, at the end of this, ILO will be happy to award you a certificate of attendance for those who have done well and contributed to the discussions and readings. And we're also happy to continue our collaboration with the Bureau, Civil Servants Bureau of Georgia, of course, as well as the Human Rights Secretariat. Thank you very much and have a wonderful session.
Thank you, Kenan. Thank you, Ms. Akiashvili, and thank you, Ms. Kardava, for these welcoming remarks that already point us in the direction of this webinar series. Before we continue with the objectives of this course and the real substance to the presentations, I think it is a good idea to make a group picture. So that at least now we have everybody here, that all the people, the champions here together with us. So you can put on your camera, and we will try to get everybody into one single shot. I cannot promise you if it will work. Patricia, can we do that all in one go? Yes, or how?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Can I just ask you, Carl, just to stop sharing your screen for the time being?
Stop share. Yes.
Also the Georgian version. Taco, if you can stop. That's it. Perfect.
Okay. Wow.
So, okay, we have 63 people. I only have. Oh, turn on your videos.
So now we have
იცით
to
რა,
say.
ვერაფრით ვერ ვთავ ვიდეოს და თუ დამეხმარებით.
Sorry, when I'm trying to start the video, it says that the host has stopped the video from me. So can you?
I'm sorry if I've
აი
done that.
სხვაებიც წერენ, რომ ვერ ვთავენ ვიდეოს და
Ask to start the video.
What do we
Okay.
say now?
თითქოს ყველა წერს,
Gorgonzola.
რომ ვერ.
We can take multiple pictures to include everyone.
Exactly.
I mean, thread.
Oh.
No.
Uh-oh.
You can start your video because არა გვაქვს ამდენის ჩართვის უფლება. მე ამას მიწევს.
Okay, this is side by side. Okay, I will try to do.
Some of them still cannot
start
video. Some of them, please.
I have. Okay, I will do one. All right.
ყველას გვიწერს ერთი და იგივეს, რომ ვიდეოს ვერ ჩავთავთ.
So many of them cannot start video. unfortunately.
Yeah, okay. Just 2 seconds. Still start. Okay, I'm taking photographs as I go along. If you could just start their videos, but not the microphone. Start videos, but not your microphone.
Don't forget to mute.
Okay.
Yes, Patricia?
Yeah, I'm taking photographs, but unfortunately a lot of people are missing. So maybe we can try doing this again. Add another. Okay. I've done quite a few photographs.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, we'll see what comes out.
Yeah.
Don't push our technological luck, huh? Before the system fully collapses.
Yes.
Okay, let's.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, and let's continue with. So you can put on the the presentation in Georgian also, huh? And let's look at the objectives of the course, huh? So probably, as already was indicated in the opening remarks, this course has to be placed within this larger framework of business and human rights. And in that regard, 2021 will be a special year. Maybe it was already mentioned in the introduction remark, but it's the 10th anniversary of the adoption of the UN Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights, of which your National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights in Georgia is a reflection of this commitment of the government of Georgia to implement this framework on respect, protect, and access to remedy for the government to protect human rights, business to respect human rights, and to ensure effective access to effective remedy. So this is the larger context in which this course is situated, and hopefully, if you are if you continue to attend this webinar series, you will be more knowledgeable about this business and human rights framework here in Georgia. And you will understand better the labor dimension within this National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, and more specifically, the role of international labor standards and what they mean from a business perspective. In total, we are looking at 12 hours of participation, 12 hours of webinar sessions that are divided as follows. This, of course, is the first webinar. And after a well-deserved holiday break, now at the end of the year, we are coming back the 20th of January with the first session on child labor and forced labor, followed by sessions on occupational safety and health, equal opportunity and non-discrimination, grievance mechanisms, women economic empowerment, and then we will end with freedom of association and collective bargaining. The idea of each session, of each webinar session, is provide you with the global perspective, what are, or the perspective from international labor standards, the main principles. For every session, we also will find and try to identify together with our Georgian colleagues champions in a specific topic. So when we are discussing occupational safety and health, we can give you the general principles, but we also will invite somebody to speak now about this new law on occupational safety and health. The same goes for all the other sessions, so that we have an ILO contribution and also a national contribution to put it in perspective, the presentations that we are doing. As indicated, all this material will be made available online, but we do encourage you to be part of the webinar, to be part of the discussions also. This is the e-campus that we are developing. For those that already have come to Turin, they will know about the ILO e-campus, the digital learning environment, where you will find more resources. You even will find copies in the Georgian language of the ILO MNE declaration, which we also will briefly mention in the presentation that will pass by, but we have it even in Georgian. It's a real collector's item outside Georgia, having this in the Georgian language. But we also will put in more information and background practical tools if needed on the different topics that we will be discussing in the webinar series. There also will be a certificate of participation that we will award for participants that are consistently participating. I always say that we are not going to police you in your participation to this webinar series. We are all adults and responsible for your own learning, but we will monitor participation, and we will take notes of who is attending and who's not attending, just to make sure that at least there is some effort behind the award of a certificate of participation, which then will be done towards the end of the webinar series, which is indeed at the end of February already. Once we conclude this final webinar, you will receive the certificate of participation. Okay, let us jump into the main topic of today, and I would like to welcome our good colleague Emily, who came out of leave to be able to be with us. Emily, thank you, and I will stop sharing my screen, at least in English, so you can manage your slides. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you, Carl. And good afternoon to everyone. I joined Carl in saying I really wish I could be with you physically, because I was so impressed with how kind and warm you all are. And it was wonderful talking to you in the teas and coffee breaks and having lunch with you. And I miss the food. It's lovely, the food in Georgia.
Sorry, just there's very bad hearing. Maybe she will speak closer to microphone, or I cannot hear almost. Please, okay. I'm sorry. Yes.
Is that better?
No, a little better, maybe. Yes. Can you? Yes.
I think I might frighten people if I'm like this the whole time. Okay. Again, if you have problems with the interpretation, hearing me, please let me know. Anyway, just to introduce myself briefly, for those of you, I see many familiar faces, but I think some of you have not met me before. So just to introduce myself briefly, my name is Emily Sims. I am the manager of the ILO Help Desk for Business. My job in the ILO is pretty much to talk mainly with companies, but also with initiatives, with trade unions, with governments, about how international labor standards principles guide company operations. So I basically translate international labor standards, which are legal instruments, into a business framework to help companies, to guide them on how they can be used to help them in their human rights due diligence, or their CSR practices, or just their desire to be better managers, and explaining what those mean for them. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what the international labor standards, where they come from, or what they are, and why they exist, and how they can help businesses. So to begin with, if you don't already know from the presentations, the international labor standards come from the ILO. And just in case you haven't heard of the ILO, it was founded in 1919 with the Treaty of Versailles after the First World War. It's a specialized agency at the UN, which means we are separate from the UN, but we work very, very closely with the United Nations. And very much coordinated along the line. The WHO is also a specialized agency of the UN. There are numerous ones. We have 187 member states. I believe there are 192 countries in the world. So almost every country in the world is a member of the ILO. And our mission is to promote social justice. And this means creating decent work, which is more and better jobs for men and women everywhere. And we do this by promoting the rights at work, employment, enhancing social protection, and strengthening social dialogue. I'm a big history buff, so I like to share history of the ILO with people. This is a photo of the very first conference of the ILO, which at that time was called the Commission. You'll see it's all men. This lone woman, I was excited at first. I thought she was a delegate. I'm glad that she participated, but she's actually the assistant to this person who's the secretariat to all these male delegates. We've come a long way since then, and if you go to a conference now, you'll see that there are as many and sometimes more women participants as men. But I admit we were a little gender unbalanced in 1919. My first question for you, I like this. I like to have a discussion with you rather than just talk to you. So you'll notice I'm going to ask you questions as we go along. The first question is, what do you think these, I guess, 30 or so men talked about? What were the burning issues in 1919? If you could just type them in the chat box. And in English or in Georgian, and which in Georgian they'll translate for me. Well, what are some issues you have? Forced labor, yeah? Anyone else? Labor rights? Yes, but they were looking at specific labor issues, labor rights issues. Labor rights? Unequal labor? Minimum wages? Okay, well, let's take a look. Hours of work in industry was a very big issue. People worked extremely long hours. Unemployment, this was right after the First World War. All of Europe was pretty much devastated. And all these decommissioned soldiers returning. The question was how to generate employment for them to keep the peace. That was actually really one of the top priorities. Maternity protection, which might surprise you, as early as 1919, and a group of all men were concerned about women workers and how to protect them and their babies while they're carrying them on the job, but also how to provide for them when they needed leave to take care of their children before returning to work. Night work by women and young people. And the minimum age for work in industry. So I think someone had mentioned child labor. This might sound familiar for you, that there might still be in Georgia, or at least Georgian companies working with companies abroad. Hours of work is still a huge issue. I get tons of questions in the help desk on hours of work. Maternity protection, there's still a lot of challenges. Employment is always going to be a challenge. Maybe night work is not so much anymore, although I do get questions still. And the minimum age is still certainly a challenge in many, many countries. So it's interesting that some of the burning questions are still burning questions. So the next question is, why do we have international labor standards? Well, there are many purposes, but the key ones are improving the living and working conditions of workers, promoting growth of enterprises and economic development, equalizing conditions for international competition. And I'll speak at the end about one of the concerns. This is a particular concern for companies. And consolidating social peace. So those are some, I think that's all of them. Those are pretty important issues. International labor standards come in a couple of forms. First, there are conventions. Conventions are actual treaties for all the states that ratify them. They're multilateral binding treaties is the technical term. States don't have to ratify any conventions, but they have to go through a process that ensures that any instruments adopted, that their representative body, normally a parliament, takes the instrument into consideration and discusses whether to ratify it. When even when they don't, when they ratify a convention, it becomes legally binding, and they have reporting obligations. They have to periodically account to ILO for how they are giving effect to the provisions in the convention, both in law and in practice. So they send both their data, but also their legislation that's given effect to the convention, but also data. What fines have been imposed for non-compliance? What are the sanctions? What are the issues that have arisen in the application of the national law? So there's a whole reporting apparatus, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But even when conventions, excuse me, aren't ratified, they can still be a source of information. There are a fair number of countries that don't ratify many conventions, but nonetheless, you can see from their national legislation that they have actually been progressively updating it as new instruments are adopted by ILO. And then there are 3 types of conventions, and we'll talk a little bit more about these: fundamental, governance, and technical conventions. There are also what are called recommendations. Recommendations are not open to ratification. Their only purpose is to give guidance to governments. They come in 2 forms. They can either supplement conventions, so they add additional content that the conference that adopted the instruments decided. There was no agreement to put them in the convention, but there was agreement that they were really important for governments to understand and take into consideration. So those supplement conventions. But there are other recommendations that are only, the subject is only in the form of recommendation. So an example of that is the older workers recommendation or the youth employment recommendation. They give guidance, but there is no sister convention that goes with that. There are also what are called protocols. Protocols are legally binding instruments on governments that ratify them, so they're like conventions, but what they're doing is updating a convention. Sometimes a convention will be replaced, they update the convention by adopting a new one, and the older one is shelved. But this is a case where the conference has said, well, the convention is okay, but something new has happened or there's something missing, and we've decided to revise or amend the convention while keeping it intact by adding this addendum, a protocol. So they're binding on governments that ratify them. And in an example that is particularly relevant to your group, because you're interested in business and human rights, is the Protocol to Convention 29 on Forced Labor, which was adopted after the different Ruggie reports and the UN guiding principles were adopted. And it amends the Convention 29 by including due diligence and including remedy, which were missing from Convention 29. So that's an example of a protocol. The features of international labor standards, there are a fair number of them. First of all, they are universal. As I mentioned, all 187 member states, they participate in the development of a convention because it's not just people discussing at the conference. There is a lot of background development of an instrument that is developed by multiple rounds of surveying member states. So they get their input on their current state on a particular issue, such as, I don't know, hours of work, what is happening in each of the member states based on a series of questions. And then as they have discussed at the first meeting of the conference, the report based on this first survey, then they go back to the member states with a draft potential instrument, and they give all the member states opportunities to comment on a proposed draft. And then they are allowed to participate in these discussions at the conference in developing the instrument, but they also get to vote at the conference. So all 187 member states have participated to a fair extent, if not heavily being involved in the drafting itself in the conference, in the development of the instrument. The instruments are also tripartite because each of the 187 member state delegations is composed of a government, of two government representatives, and a workers' representative, and an employer's representative. And they all have a voice at the conference, and they all have a right to vote. So it's not just government's views, but the views of the government, employers, and workers that are involved in shaping and voting on the instruments. Another important thing to bear in mind is that the international labor standards are setting minimum standards because they are standards everyone voting on, participating in shaping these instruments agrees that is achievable in their own country. So it is by nature setting a floor because not every country has the same level of development and resources at their disposal, maybe the development of their administration systems. So they're setting minimums. And the idea is that governments, even when they ratified them, the idea is that they implement them and then with continuous improvement, see if they can keep making improvements that going beyond the conventions themselves. And because of that approach of setting minimum standards, there's also a flexibility. So you'll see in different international labor standards, sometimes options set out, they're not really rigid instruments, although they vary from subject to subject and they vary depending if they're very early, and the early ones are more prescriptive and rigid, but the later ones are setting up frameworks with objectives and general guidance on the right path there, but they leave to the states to figure out in a tripartite dialogue structure, what actually is the best path for them as Georgia or India or China. So it has a lot of flexibility built into that, not the what, because the rights are not negotiable, but the how to achieve those rights in the national context. So you have spoken a little bit about fundamental conventions. They were mentioned in some of the opening comments because they are particularly important. There are 4 different areas for the fundamental conventions. They are around forced labor. There are 2 conventions that deal with forced labor, 2 that deal with non-discrimination, 2 that deal with child labor, 1 on minimum age and 1 on the worst forms, and then 2 that deal with freedom of association and collective bargaining. These are considered the fundamental conventions because they're not just rights. They are rights, but they're not just rights. They are also enabling rights, which means that, for instance, if you're in forced labor, if someone is physically keeping you there or keeping you there by tying you to the enterprise, they're probably not really worried about your safety and health. They may not even be paying you, and they're not concerned about the hours of work and whether they're respecting them. You're in forced labor, you are stuck there. You've been stripped of your liberty to leave. So it's an enabling right to make sure that people are not in forced labor situations so that their rights are respected around the whole range of rights. It's the same with non-discrimination. If you, by virtue of being female or being from the wrong religion or being from the wrong ethnic group, are kept out of employment, or you're allowed to work someplace, but not in certain jobs, and your pay may be different because you're a woman than a man. Those sorts of things. If you are discriminated against, then you don't even get, in many cases, to all the other rights or certain of the other rights. And with child labor, if you're a young person who is taken out of school too early, you don't have an adequate education, you don't have a set of skills that allows you to freely choose what you want to do with your life, how you want to support yourself and your family, then again, that liberty has been taken away from you. That makes you more weak, more vulnerable, and it keeps you and your family in poverty. And it keeps actually the whole society in the trap of poverty. And with freedom of association and collective bargaining, those are enabling rights because it is exactly allowing employers to organize and workers to organize into associations that strengthen their voice, that give them more power to stand up for their rights, that helps them negotiate better wages, to reduce hours of work, to avoid abuses that lead to grievances at work, that ensure that they can bargain for a better wage. That's why these are the fundamental conventions. It's because these are the prerequisites for every individual worker and every collective of workers in a trade union to be able to secure their rights at work. I want to stop for a moment to see if anyone has any questions. And Carl, please feel free to interrupt me when you see that there are some interesting questions or people that want to make comments. Otherwise, I'll just keep going.
I also would like to, I see there were one comment in English, but maybe Taco, Taco, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, were there any other comments that I missed because of the language issues? I see from Georgia is what kind of recommendation do you follow during the pandemic time? And I'm not sure if that is a question or what kind of recommendation. And then secondly, what does government do in case when parents force children to go to the street and to become a beggar? Huh? That's a concrete question indeed. Huh?
Okay. For the first question, we actually have set up on the ILO help desk. You'll see on the homepage of the help desk a section that's just on COVID-19, and it has all the different tools and resources the ILO has developed. And there are so many of them, I wouldn't believe it. But there are, sector-specific guidance on OSH, on telework, on higher risk of domestic violence for workers working from home, all sorts of different issues. There's a brief on socially responsible restructuring because, as you unfortunately probably know, there are lots of businesses around the world that are collapsing because of the pandemic and they need to restructure to save themselves. So there's a brief there that you'll find. There are lots and lots of different tools. So depending on what exactly you're looking for, you're bound to find it. Probably not in Georgian, but maybe if you find something in English that is interesting, maybe you can discuss with Keenan's project about the possibility of translating the most useful or relevant of those tools into Georgian and to be able to distribute those to your participating members in the project. And the second question about what do you do if it's the parents who are behind child labor. It often is the parents behind child labor because they are the ones pulling them out of schools and sending them off to work, or in this case, the question I'd asked about begging in the street. That's a really big challenge because the parents are often so desperate, which is why they're doing that in the first place. What a government can do is maybe collectively with an association of parents, or stepping up their collaboration between different agencies of the government and education division to tighten up on absentee students to make sure that they're in school. One of the most successful programs that has been developed around tackling child labor, where it's the parent that really is strongly driving the child labor, was developed in Brazil, but has been adopted in other countries. It's called the Bolsa Familia. It's in exchange for verified attendance of the child in school, the parents get a monthly income supplement that goes into a special account that they can access that is in effect paying the parents to keep the children in school. That, coupled with very strong interventions around the importance of keeping kids in school and strengthening vocational education opportunities for kids in school, because sometimes parents are motivated by fear that their kids aren't learning anything useful in school that will help them get a practical job. Those sorts of things. But we have a whole web page on child labor also, and some tools that might be useful if you want to pursue this topic in more depth. Okay, well, returning to our presentation, because I don't want to go over my time and be rude to the other speaker. Let's just briefly unpack what the governance and priority conventions are as well. There are three areas, actually. These are the same thing, but different sectors. This is general labor inspection and labor inspection specific to agriculture. Because of the remote nature of agriculture, it has often a different regime, a legal regime in countries. So these are two instruments around this, because the whole idea of governance conventions is that these are really important conventions. They're also, along with the fundamentals, reviewed every 2 years instead of every 5 years, which is the majority of the conventions, because they're so important. If you don't have good labor inspection and that it's working extremely well, it doesn't matter what the law says. It doesn't matter how many conventions the government has ratified. It is labor inspection, which is the difference between law being actually implemented and effective and being worthless. So these are priority conventions because of that. The other one that's really important is the Employment Policy Convention. It goes back to that concept of liberty that I talked about regarding forced labor, child labor, non-discrimination. If you don't have a job in the formal sector, you don't have any rights at work, because the government doesn't know you exist and it cannot intervene in any way to protect you. So if you're working illegally in a formal enterprise, or if the enterprise itself is not formal, the rights of the workers effectively don't exist. They're simply there at the will of the employer to hopefully respect their rights anyway. But that's not any way to exist as workers. So the Employment Policy Convention is a very high priority as well, because the goal of that is to create as many jobs in the formal sector as possible, to make sure that everyone has the right to work in the formal sector. And the other one is the tripartite, the Convention on Tripartite Consultation. And what that is doing is setting up a framework so that the government, in promoting employment policy, in adopting national labor legislation, in developing its labor administration and labor inspection system. It is doing that in close consultation with the workers, who are the people who are supposed to be protected in this process, and with the employers, the ones who are responsible for carrying out what is reflected in government policy and in national labor legislation. Because if you don't have both the employers and workers strongly buying into this whole process, having faith and confidence that it respects their rights as both workers and employers, and that it is done in a way that takes into account their experience, then you will have always a suboptimal system. So that's why the Tripartite Consultation Convention is so very important and considered a priority. The international labor standards cover a lot of other topics as well. Vocational guidance and training, employment security, wages, safety and health, violence and harassment at work, social security, maternity protection, social policy, migrant workers, indigenous and tribal peoples, maybe less relevant in Georgia, but HIV/AIDS in the workplace, specific categories of workers because of the peculiarities of the way they work. So it covers just about everything you can imagine. And then in addition to international labor standards, we have a whole host of guidelines, codes of practice. So for instance, the other day, a company was looking for guidance on a good policy on alcohol and drugs and how it relates to their work practices and balancing it with the privacy issues of the workers concerned. If you want, I can send that to you. It actually turned out to be very helpful. They wrote back and said, oh, this is great. But we have a lot of instruments like that as well. So, and on the website of the help desk, you will find everything organized by topic. So it's very easy. A brief introduction, questions and answers from companies that have actually asked questions, but also there's always a space that has specific tools on that particular topic, and as well as the relevant international labor standards. So hopefully that will be a very useful resource for you. So another quiz. What is the most widely ratified ILO convention? So you have three choices. Convention 87 on freedom of association and protection of the right to organize, Convention 29 on forced labor, or Convention 182 on the worst forms of child labor. So if you just type in the number 87 or 29 or 182 and let me know which one you think is the most widely ratified of the ILO conventions. Convention 182. Any other guesses? 29? 29? 87, 87? 29? 182? Okay. Well, the answer is it's 182. 182 is the first convention of the ILO to be universally ratified. That means all the member states have ratified it, which is quite a feat because, yeah, there are very few that are even close to universal ratification. And that happened, actually, I think the beginning of this year. Togo, I think, was the last country to ratify. So congratulations to Convention 182. It's very exciting. Hopefully it's the first of many to come. I will just touch on briefly, but it's really important to bear in mind that gender equality flows through all of our conventions. I would love to say that you look at a convention from 1919 and you'll see very gender inclusive language. You won't. You'll hear universal he and the standard male and his family and things like that. So the language is not so gender inclusive for the old conventions. For the new ones, yes. But even when the language was not so great, we've always had a very strong consciousness about gender equality. You'll remember one of the first topics discussed by this all-male group was maternity protection. So we have different kinds of, by gender equality, there are different things I mean. So some of them are ones that the whole convention is on gender equality, or gender equality is part of non-discrimination in gender in general. So the Equal Remuneration Convention, it's about gender differences in pay and reducing the pay gap between men and women. Non-discrimination is about, one of the 7 grounds for non-discrimination is on the basis of sex. Workers with family responsibilities is talking about men and women workers who have family responsibilities, who need more awareness of from their employers about the challenges sometimes of balancing responsibilities and setting up government policy frameworks and enterprise policy frameworks for bringing more attention to that and finding better ways to balance work and family. And the Violence and Harassment Convention is about violence and harassment, but it has a which is not necessarily gender related, but has often a very strong gendered component to it. And there's a whole subsection of the convention that talks specifically about gender related issues. But there are also other instruments, such as the Maternity Protection Convention, which obviously affects just women, but also the Domestic Workers Convention, which women are not the only domestic workers, but they're the vast majority of them. And it talks about the particularities of domestic workers and the vulnerabilities about working and living with your employer. I should say, for the most recent Maternity Protection Convention, there is this notion of paternity or the rights of men regarding leave once their child is born. So now moving, I hope I'm not moving too fast, but briefly to cover how international labor standards are supervised. Because we have quite an elaborate supervisory machinery. It's actually recognized as the most sophisticated in international law around human rights issues, I should say. Intellectual property is really, really good, and the trade is really, really good. But in related to human rights, we have what is regarded as the most effective supervisory machinery. So there are 2 parts: regular supervision and special procedures. For regular supervision, there are 2 standing bodies. The Committee of Experts on the Application of Conventions and Recommendations. There are 20 of them, 20 experts. They are eminent jurists from around the world. They serve, I think, 5-year terms, and I think they serve for a maximum of 2 terms. Their objective is to be completely independent and give a purely technical perspective on whether governments that have ratified these conventions and are sending these reports on how they're doing in implementing the conventions. This is the body that reviews all those reports and has a dialogue with the governments on areas where they're doing well and areas where they need to do more because it's not so good. They're in violation of their obligations concerning the conventions. What they do is produce a report, and that report goes to this committee. This is a conference committee made up of employers, workers, and governments that are part of the delegation to the conference. And they review this report, and they put it back in a political context, because these are delegates. They're not technical experts. They are delegates, and they're having a political discussion. They talk about the report in general, but then they have a list of cases that they discuss. Some of them are because the country has made so much progress, or because they've done something really interesting and innovative that they want to shine a spotlight on. But a lot of the cases are problem cases, and they invite the government to have a discussion about, hey, what's going on? What's the problem? Why can't you live up to your obligations? and invite the government to respond. And I can assure you, governments don't like being on this list when it's the third category of problem cases. So a lot of them, just the concern about ending up on the list motivates a lot of them to accelerate their progress. But even the ones that end up being discussed in the conference, a lot of them do decide, hey, you know, we've just made a public commitment. We're gonna make improvements quickly. Some of them not so much, and it ends up being something, a decision to send a special delegation of observers to see what's going on the ground. That happened in the case of that happened in the case of apartheid, in the case of Myanmar. But often, can I ask everyone to mute themselves? Salome? Maybe no, not Salome. Sorry, you're.
It's okay. I've muted him. Don't worry. I've done it.
Thank you. Now there are also special procedures. There are two types. There are ones that are based on constitutional provisions. This one, and there's also the Committee on Freedom of Association, which is also has constitutional origin, but it's a standing committee as well. So representations are when employers or workers or both feel that their government is not living up to their obligations under a convention that they have ratified. So they can submit an Article 24 complaint that will go to the Committee of Experts. Then there are also Article 26 complaints. This is when another government that has ratified the same convention as the government in question submits a complaint saying, hey, we're both parties to this treaty. Remember, these are multilateral binding treaties, which means that any member of that treaty, any government that has ratified that treaty, actually has standing to complain about someone else not living up to their obligations. So this is the process for that. It actually follows, that's the common practice in international law in general. And those complaints have a different process. They go to the governing body to discuss, and maybe also the conference, depending on how it goes in the governing body. And then there's the Committee on Freedom of Association, where any employer or worker, even in the case when the government has not ratified Convention 87 or 98, which are the two core conventions that the Committee of Freedom of Association has sort of jurisdiction over, they can bring a complaint saying, hey, our government is not living up to these commitments. And the reason they can bring it for any government is that this is the one area where the ILO has said, hey, if you cannot even agree on the principles set out in these two conventions on freedom of association and collective bargaining, you're in the wrong club. You don't belong here. So by virtue of being a member, you have been deemed to have accepted the provisions of these two conventions. So that's the supervisory machinery. It's important to point out, though, that the only behavior or the only people, the only entities being scrutinized are states. States either because they ratified a convention under the regular supervision, or they are a member state of the ILO as part of the Committee on Freedom of Association, but it's always the state, the actions of the state that are under scrutiny. We do not look at company behavior. We do not judge companies. We do not have any complaints mechanisms for asking the ILO to look in on company behavior. The reason I stress that is I get a lot of complaints in the help desk. My employer is not living up to convention, whatever. There is no mechanism for the ILO to look into such complaints. So one of the questions is, why are all these companies using international labor standards? If you look at a code of practice from a company, if you look at a multi-stakeholder initiative, the Global Compact, even the UN Guiding Principles that reference back to the international labor standards, the OECD guidelines that reference back to the international labor standards, Why? Why are all these, I explained there's treaties that bind states, only governments can ratify them. Why are all these companies talking about labor standards? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One, international labor standards are very coherent with each other. Anytime a new instrument is discussed and ultimately adopted, all the other labor standards are scrutinized to make sure that everything is consistent amongst all of them. That might not seem like a big deal, but I can tell you it is a big deal to make sure that they're coherent, because any company will tell you it's rather frustrating to be pulled in different directions with different standards, people making stuff up. Having one set of standards that is not only, one that's clearly identified, but that it's coherent within itself is really useful to a company. There's also a high level of credibility because, as I mentioned, it's not a handful of governments, it's 187 governments. And each government delegation is not just government, but the employers and workers. So companies that are worried about being criticized by their supplier for having international labor standards in their code of conduct, saying, hey, this doesn't have anything to do with me, my country is not the same as your country, say, well, international labor standards come from 187 countries, and it's likely your supplier is one of those countries. But it's not just credibility with your suppliers or other countries which you're interacting with, but also credibility with one of your potential biggest critics, workers. Remember, the trade unions are right there shaping international labor standards. So you have a lot of credibility as a company to say, hey, look, I'm not making this stuff up. I am going by what your own group, the trade unions, also agreed to. And that gets to the third point. It also creates boundaries for companies. Remember, I talked about decent work, meaning more and better jobs for men and women everywhere. The better refers to the rights, but the more refers to the jobs, which means one of the obsessions with the ILO, in addition to workers' rights, is employment. Employment for men and women everywhere in the formal sector, in thriving, healthy companies, which means we're always looking at how best to balance ensuring protection and respect for workers' rights in a way that also ensures that companies can formalize, they can grow, and they can thrive and survive. So it's setting boundaries because not everything should be dumped on companies. Companies have their responsibilities and governments have their responsibilities, and it has to be both of them working together and not just all on the shoulders of business. It's also not surprising because the genesis of the ILO itself are two businessmen. This is Robert Owen, he was from Wales, and Daniel Legrand, he was Swiss, but operating in the Alsace region in France. They were not writing together, they're writing separately, but they're writing at about the same time, at the very end of the 19th century, 1870s, 80s, 90s. What they're writing about is industrialization. They're talking about how many good things, and this is when industrialization was really taking off. They were talking about the good things. Wow, there's more stuff. It's much more affordable for people. The quality is improved in many cases, but also the ugly things about how many people have been forced to leave their homes from the countryside and migrate to look for work, the atrocious conditions in which they live and work, and their abuse and vulnerability. And what they're ultimately talking about is the future of industrialization, and arguing that if there isn't a set of minimum standards that create a level playing field for all countries in the world, because remember, this is when there were no borders as far as trade was concerned. Trade was open, completely open. They were arguing that there needs to be a level playing field amongst countries, setting a minimum set of standards that everyone abides by. Otherwise, industrialization is going to collapse. You're going to face revolution. And so that was the genesis of the ILO. And the first conference was actually in 1904. It didn't take off, nothing much came of it. But after the First World War and after the Russian Revolution, boom, everyone was motivated to talk about labor standards. And you had 6 adopted just in the first year. So they are the brainchild behind it. So it's not so strange that even though these are instruments for government, the origin of them is business, and now it's coming back to business in terms of them using it in their own operating practices. I think this is the last slide, or the next to the last slide. I just want to emphasize for you though, even though companies are using labor standards, they are not the subject of labor standards. They do not bind, I should say, the object in international law of labor standards. Labor standards are addressed to government, and the only way they bind companies is through national legislation, either because they've ratified them or they've decided to implement the provisions anyway, even without ratification. And it's that national law that binds enterprises. Of course, they're free to adopt the principles and incorporate them into their own human resource practices or their sourcing practices, which is what they're doing more and more, but they are non-binding. And the reason I stress this is I get so many complaints in the help desk. Hey, my company is not living up to the provisions in this convention. You need to do something about it. I can't do anything about it because they are not the object of international labor standards. Only governments are. But having said that, we still encourage them to use the principles, and we have an ME declaration that sets them out in a more coherent framework that makes it a little more accessible and easy for companies to understand. We also have the help desk, which is my job, to help people. And so I have conversations with companies or, as I said, government organizations, for instance, in their procurement practices or in their development aid programs. They have projects and they're looking to incorporate labor standards as part of those projects, such as the one that Keenan is overseeing in Georgia. But anyway, anyone is open to ask me a question, and I'm happy to help you and work with you however I can. I'll stop there. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Emily. Indeed, I will share now my screen. Are there any, before we continue, are there any questions, any burning questions you have at this moment for Emily on the topic that we just discussed? Any questions?
You can always save them for future sessions we'll have together as well.
Exactly. I'll keep
it's okay to move on.
I can keep like a few seconds of silence.
Okay.
Let it sink in.
Well, I'm going to cheat and drink my tea anyway, if that's okay.
Carl, if it's fine, I will remind in Georgian that they could use chat box for Georgian questions.
Okay, good.
კითხვები თუ გაქვთ ან კომენტარები ემილის სესიასთან დაკავშირებით chat box-ში რა დაწერა და
If you have any questions, just you may write in chat box. You may write them in Georgian, and I will translate them for you in English. So if you wish.
Okay.
I'll also stay on. I would like to see the next part of the session, the next speaker. And if you happen to think of questions during that period, I can always, at the end, answer your questions.
Huh? And we are, like Emily also said, we still have opportunities after the holiday breaks to interact on the many topics we discussed now. Okay, let's go then to the final presenter of today. Is Miss Kayaya. I hope I pronounce it correctly. From the Human Rights Secretariat. Hi, Mary. I can see you now, please.
Can you hear me?
We can also hear you. Thank you for joining, and the microphone is yours now.
Thank you. მოგესალმებით, მეგობრებო. პირველ რიგში მინდა მადლობა
First of all, I would like to thank our partners. My name is Mary Kajai. I'm a specialist expert from Human Rights Secretariat. I will brief you about the Business and Human Rights chapter in our National Action Plan on Human Rights. And let me start by, mentioning 2017. In 2017, Human Rights Secretariat, together with the Public Defender and Development Agency, carried out National Basic Survey, the survey which was carried out together with the Danish Human Rights Organization, and our objective was to find out National Action Plan priorities and recommendations on business and human rights. And in this respect, we would apply UN guidelines, while working on this document. During this survey, we would organize different meetings with state agencies, business circles, and all stakeholders. And business and human rights were major key issues, but we also would analyze existing legislation, and we identify major challenges which would help us to promote responsible business conduct in the field of human rights, environment protection issues, anti-corruption activities, personal data, and this survey was the kind of foundation for elaboration of our National Action Plan on Human Rights. And in 2018, sorry, can I move to another slide? Could you help me? Thank you. And there was a National Action Plan 2018-2020, and we would address major issues. So its objective is to promote free entrepreneurship. Well, altogether we have 28 objectives and 39 activities. And Human Rights Secretariat is working very closely with ILO and Civil Society Development Agency, CIDA. And of course, I would not go into all 28 objectives or 39 activities, but as I mentioned, altogether, I will not address 29 objectives, but I will identify certain priorities. One of them is UN guidelines, to support these guidelines and its introduction in Georgian reality. And the so-called, these guidelines, of course, very important for countries. They're truly guidelines for us to promote business and human rights and to avoid, human rights violation in business corporations. And we attach huge importance to these guidelines. One priority is, to have a unified policy when it comes to business and human rights, and also to promote, responsible business conduct and public awareness raising, and to promote women entrepreneurship. As I mentioned, altogether there are 28 objectives. Different ministries and agencies are stakeholders in this respect. First and foremost, Government of Georgia, Ministry of Economy and Sustainable Development, Ministry of Justice, and so on and so forth. As it was mentioned by Lela, in 2018-2020 action plan was, now it will, very soon we will, just have a new action plan for a new period of time. And here, human rights and business is a priority. and we would pay special attention, you know, to those issues which we failed to solve or to address due to, you know, COVID-19 pandemic. Though some part of activities were carried out, vast majority of them, but there are some outstanding issues which will be addressed next year. That's in a nutshell what I wanted to say. Once again, thank you very much. Hopefully I was not very fast. In fact, she was truly very fast. Thank you.
Thank you. I suppose this was the end, huh? Sorry. Thank you for this final words on the business. Not the final words, maybe the beginning of the discussions on business and human rights. Let me continue here on my slide. Start the video. Thank you for this, Ms. Kayaya, for these presentations and for these words on business and human rights. I see still a comment that came in from Nino on that indeed human rights should be the basic value for every society, and should be practiced, not only something which has been put on paper, but also has to be put into practice. And of course, we fully agree with that. I would like to start, if there are any further questions or even comments, I would like, with the wrapping up of this first webinar, and maybe I want to hand over for some final words by Kenan, before we extend the invitation for the final webinar, for the next webinar in 2021. Kenan, you would like to say something still?
Well, actually, I just wanted to thank everyone. I think it was an excellent introductory session. We've got to know a bit about the strategy, the action plan. We also introduced what's behind the ILO conventions and the standards. There are usually a lot of confusions of what they are and what's exactly governments are like responsible to. So I think this was an excellent start. We're looking forward to continuing the webinars over the next 6 weeks. I know now there will be, Carl will come back to us in January. Now everyone has a long Christmas break starting in Turin next week, and then Georgia until probably mid-January. So I think this is the time where everyone's going to be away, but or at least away at home, away from work, but at home still. So I want to thank everyone, and we wish you all the best. Back to you, Carl.
Yes, thank you, Kenan. We're not going anywhere. So thank you again, Ms. Akiashvili, Ms. Catherine Kardava, Ms. Kayaya, also Kenan, for also putting this together with the colleagues in Georgia. Thank you also, Emily. I would let you go now into your holidays. Emily, thank you for being with us today. Enjoy your Christmas break and your end of year,
Yes, hope to be back with you next year. Bye-bye. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to everyone.
So as you can see, we will pick up, like this was just the introduction webinar. This was just the first way of putting it all together, this webinar. So we are really starting now next year on the 20th of January, Wednesday, 20th of January, at the same time, when we will be jumping into the topic of child labor and forced labor. So I hope to see you all back in a few weeks. Please stay safe, stay healthy, stay inside, but nevertheless have a great celebration for the end of the year. It's time that we stop 2020 and that we are looking with a lot of hope for 2021. Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you, Taco.
Bye.
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 Thank you very much.